Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello everyone, welcome. I am going to analyze in very brief terms, of course, the presidency and the post-presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was born in 1924 and died 100 years later, just this last December of 2024. President Carter has been a figure of praise as well as criticism. There are roughly 1,000 books about this president. This is a president who, by his own admission later in life, by the way, he agreed that there were people who did not particularly view his presidency as very effective, although there is almost universal, not quite, there are also critics about his post-presidency period. In other words, after 1981 until his recent passing, there are people who criticize him for meddling in foreign affairs and all of that. But for the most part, within the United States and globally, there is universal praise about his role as a man committed to international peace, to environmental justice, to social justice, and to human rights. So it seems there are two Jimmy Carters. One, the president, the politician. Actually, he was state senator in the 60s, and then in the early 70s, he was governor of Georgia and then president in the late 70s. So that's one Jimmy Carter, and there are criticisms of that Jimmy Carter. However, there is almost universal praise for the period that he spent after he was out of politics. Now, let me point out, before I delve into this man who I regard fundamentally a moral man, the fact is that no one in the United States can become president or actually hold a high office, political office, but especially the presidency, and not be fully committed to the social contract, which social contract in the case of the United States, especially in our time, in our era, in the 20th century and in the 21st century, means a firm commitment, an unyielding commitment to Wall Street, okay, to the privileged capitalist elites. Jimmy Carter, we'll see, knew that very well, as well as to the Defense Department, to the military-industrial complex. He knew that very well, coming from a background of the armed forces, by the way, in the Navy. Now, Jimmy Carter, the theme of this, the thesis of this session on Jimmy Carter's life, both as a politician and as well as a civilian, is Moral Man, Immoral Society, and this has been taken from a book published in 1932 by an American theologian. His name is Reinhold Niebuhr. And the book, Moral Man, Immoral Society, was one that influenced President Carter himself. Um, uh, the uh, the idea here is to point out, without telling you about the book, because this is not the topic. The topic is the president, the former president, the life of the president and his life as a former president. The idea here is that it is impossible for a head of state and anyone really in politics to be serving a morality, in this case of President Carter. He was a born-again Christian. He was committed to Christian morality, Christian values, which were communitarian. He was committed to an agenda of civil rights and human rights. It's just impossible. And also social justice, by the way. It's impossible to pursue that when you are the president of the United States. By the way, just in case people think that this is just the United States, it's just as difficult to do the same thing if you are in Japan or in China or in Germany. The fact is that the head of state will serve the social contract, and the social contract is designed to cater to the socioeconomic elites. I want to make sure that people understand that this was a president who was driven as a born-again Christian by a fundamental Christian morality. However, as a politician, he knew very well that opportunism is at the heart of political life. And in fact, he did sink toward opportunism, and he followed, whether in Georgia as a governor or as president, he followed the path that he knew was the path that would cater to the elites. Let me start out by saying something about his life, his early life, and his family background. His father was a small businessman. He owned a general store. He invested in farming. Jimmy Carter came, of course, to own as many people know, a mid-size, I would say, mid-size peanut farm in Plains, Georgia. He was, from everything we know about his education, he was a brilliant student. In college, he majored in nuclear physics and engineering. He pursued a career in the Navy. He had traveled, so he had quite a bit of background in that regard from the armed forces. He grew up during the early Cold War and was molded by the militarism of the Cold War, but also during the early Cold War, the fact is that the United States had remained a society that was segregated. And this man lived in the South. He lived in Georgia. He knew more than anyone what segregation was. He grew up in a segregated society. In 1970, although privately he was against it, in 1970, when he ran for governor, by the way, of Georgia, in order to win the governorship of Georgia, and he did win in 71, he took over, he won the governorship, but he reverted back to, at times openly racist, at times crypto racist, remarks so that the white population of Georgia would support him. Now, once in office, once he was in office, he tried to distance himself from the campaign rhetoric of segregation and racism. He has been criticized for that, for following an immoral path to secure political office. Even some of his black friends and supporters pointed out, well, he couldn't have won if he did not cater to the white racists of Georgia in 1970. That's true. He could not have won because that's what they wanted to hear. So that's what he told them. He tried to do what he could once in office to make sure that the state of Georgia was a state as free of racism as possible. This is in the 1970s. I want to point out that, however, that while he was in office as governor, he came into some other major decisions also requiring moral dilemmas. The question was whether to cater to the business, to the capitalist class. Some of the biggest corporations, by the way, in the United States and in fact in the world, are based in Georgia. Coca-Cola, for one thing, from communications companies to this bottling company and other businesses, he immediately sided with them. He also found out that the bonds of Georgia, he wanted to float bonds, state bonds. He found out that the key player in selling those bonds, floating those bonds, was at that time the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan Bank, by the way, is now part of J.P. Morgan Chase. Okay, just for the record. The Rockefeller family back in the 70s was very influential with both political parties, Democrats and Republicans. Kissinger had worked for the Rockefellers, and a number of people that would wind up in the Carter cabinet worked for the Rockefeller family. So the Rockefeller family was very important. Carter went to New York, met David Rockefeller, and Carter had requested that David Rockefeller introduce him to bankers so he can sell them the bonds, he can talk about the bonds, the state bonds of Georgia. Rockefeller then made him a member of the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission may sound sinister, maybe it is, but the fact is, no, it's not as sinister as it sounds. This Trilateral Commission was headed by David Rockefeller. It is a number of very wealthy people like David Rockefeller, like the Rockefeller family, from Japan, Canada, Western Europe. It was an organization intended to influence public policy on a world scale among the developed countries from the US to Europe to Japan, Canada, and to impact foreign economic policy in the rest of the world. So the Trilateral Commission was very, very important. Jimmy Carter became a member in 73 of the Trilateral Commission. He would rely on David Rockefeller for people to run his administration once he came to office in 70s. He was elected in 76. He came to office in January 77, of course. And David Rockefeller, the Rockefeller family had enormous influence. We have to remember, by the way, that David Rockefeller's brother Nelson was vice president under Jerry Ford. So we have to put that into the context as well to give you an idea of how influential this family was. Now, Jimmy Carter came out of nowhere in 76 announcing his candidacy as Southern candidate. We hadn't seen one of those in the United States since Lyndon B. Johnson back in the 60s, who, of course, inherited and from Kennedy, who was assassinated in Johnson's state of Texas. And then, of course, Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater and easily defeated him in 64. Now, Jimmy Carter comes out of nowhere. He had that Southern charm that the rhetoric was seemed to be left liberal. It seemed to be that he would follow George McGovern's agenda of 1972. For those of you who are not aware, George McGovern was the Democratic candidate of the Democratic Party in 1972. He ran against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, of course, would later be removed from. Actually, he voluntarily took himself out of office because of the Watergate break-in of the Democratic headquarters. George McGovern actually liked Jimmy Carter's candidacy. He liked what he heard, and he endorsed Jimmy Carter for president. Jimmy Carter did become president with the help of media and Wall Street. Remember, he was a member of the Trilateral Commission, well entrenched with big business and the Rockefeller family. He manages to win the campaign, win the presidential election. As soon as he took over, however, he changed his tune. And this is one of the reasons that George McGovern, who was a New Deal Democrat, and he assumed that Jimmy Carter would become a New Deal Democrat. Once Jimmy Carter, however, was in office, he abandoned the social development path and the Keynesian economics of more fair distribution of income. That went out the window. Jimmy Carter, once in office, was solidly pro-Wall Street and pro-military industrial complex. And this is the reason that Senator George McGovern withdrew the support very quickly from the president. Now, I should tell you parenthetically, by the way, that Jimmy Carter himself, so we have no misunderstanding about this, recognized that is exactly what he did, that he abandoned the New Deal / Keynesian path of political economy and social development and went toward the path of laying the foundations for the neoliberal political economy of deregulation, privatization of public assets, corporate subsidies, okay, and the historical antecedents to class warfare, as we'll see. He went against the trade unions. In 2016, okay, just so that there are no misunderstandings about this, former President Carter himself recognized what he had done. So he actually admitted that he voted for Sanders, who was the candidate against Hillary Clinton, the Cold War liberal, neoliberal, militarist Democrat. And he voted, former President Jimmy Carter voted for Sanders, who was in fact carrying on the tradition of the McGovern wing of the party, the George McGovern wing of the party from the 1970s, that Jimmy Carter, a lot of people voted for him assuming that's what he would do, but he did not, okay? Now, let me point out, by the way, that in the 1970s was a turbulent decade, without a doubt. Vietnam War ends and the United States was in a state of malaise, as some put it. It was, there were a lot of people who felt a sense of shock that the American empire, as William Appleman Williams, the great historian from the University of Wisconsin, put it, retreated from Vietnam, lost the war in Vietnam. The American empire was declining. At the same time, in the 1970s, the United States experienced something else. The rise of Japan, the rise of Northwest Europe, losing Vietnam, and after the Yom Kippur War in 1973 in Israel against its Arab neighbors, there is an energy crisis. Yes, because of OPEC, but there's an energy crisis. And the price of energy skyrockets. So there is inflation, not just in the US, but throughout the world. There are inflationary pressures. Okay. And there's only so much that corporations can pass on to the consumer, the rest they have to eat up. So there was an outcry by neoliberals like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and others from the Chicago School who had already, with the help of the CIA, by the way, and the US government, were helping the dictator of Chile after the CIA overthrew the government of Chile in 1973, Augusto Pinochet, overthrew Salvador Allende and installed General Augusto Pinochet. The CIA and the neoliberal economies were helping Chile implement neoliberal policies, which means deregulation, corporate subsidies, lower taxes for the rich and the corporations, lower tariffs, privatization of public entities. All of this against the background in Carter's presidency. Domestically, we'll divide this into domestic and foreign policy. Domestically, Carter comes in and he's facing inflationary pressures, high unemployment, by the way, historically high, 2.5 times higher than the historical levels. So he's facing high unemployment, he's facing inflation, stagflation, the GDP growth is at low levels. Corporations, that is, Wall Street is complaining that profit margins are low. So there is pressure of what to do. Jimmy Carter had promised social development, protecting the social safety net, protecting workers' incomes, strengthening the working class, strengthening the middle class, from which he came, by the way. He himself was Jimmy Carter came from a middle class family. He did none of that. Instead, he accepted two people, one who was in the Trilateral Commission as that the Rockefeller family, that was close to the Rockefeller family. His name is Paul Volcker, who became the Federal Reserve chief, the chief of the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker remained Federal Reserve chief under Carter as well as Reagan's term. He pursued what we call a monetarist policy. Paul Volcker made it very clear what monetarism entailed. Monetarism means that we have a Fed policy that tightens the monetary supply and raises interest rates, so that squeezes demand. He made no apologies about the fact that this monetarist road, which the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, follows when they impose austerity on the global South countries, by the way, Paul Volcker made it very clear back then that this would hit the middle class and the working class. No apologies about it. He said that's the sacrifice we have to make for a longer term healthier economy, although that never came, by the way, for the working class and the middle class. All we have seen since then is the decline of the working class and the decline of the middle class. This took place during the Carter presidency. This was a man, Paul Volcker, like Jimmy Carter, and the Vice President of the United States, by the way, Walter Mondale, all linked to the Rockefeller family and the Trilateral Commission. The other man that was brought in, that Carter brought in, very even more hawkish, more pro Wall Street, more unapologetically, more corporate, pro corporate, unapologetically pro capital, anti labor, was Alfred Kahn, the anti inflation czar that um, Jimmy Carter presented as a man who would help fight inflation in America. Alfred Kahn, you can fight inflation a lot of ways. One way is, in fact, to lower consumer demand. You lower consumer demand, uh, you're not going to impact the upper class, the wealthiest, let's say even 25%, although it's narrower than that. It's the bottom two-thirds that are going to be impacted. That's exactly who was impacted. So the combination of Alfred Kahn's anti-inflationary policies and the monetarism of Paul Volcker put a squeeze on the economy. And then, of course, at the same time, Jimmy Carter began to pursue, to lay some of the foundations for the neoliberal era of deregulation, privatization, anti-labor policies that would come during the Reagan period. He went after trade unions. He went after trade unions. He also, at the same time, while going after trade unions, instead of strengthening trade unions, he attacked trade unions. At the same time, he bailed out the Chrysler Auto Corporation company, car company in Detroit, one of the big three, as they're called, um, signaling what would later become as a normal practice, corporate subsidies. Now, it's true, by the way, at the time, I remember, in fact, Leah Iacocca was the CEO of Chrysler. Obviously, Leah Iacocca boasted that, yes, we took this money, taxpayer money, we took all these millions. However, we paid it back. We paid it back. Now, a lot of that. That's why I'm saying these are these are the preconditions to the neoliberal policies that Reagan would follow. Uh, After Reagan, through Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush and so forth, all the presidents thereafter would just take the money. The government would just give them the money, and those were never to be, in most cases, never to be returned. So they were gifts. So Carter laid the foundations. He was the precursor for the neoliberal era in that regard. He also began deregulating the airline and the trucking industry, by the way. Again, that's exactly what the neoliberals would do from Reagan onwards. The idea of deregulation was, well, the consumer would be best served. Well, was the consumer best served? Or was this another scheme of attacking the working class, attacking the workers of these industries, and transferring income from the bottom up to the corporations? That's exactly what happened, by the way. And there are a number of books on the trucking industry and the airline industry, the consolidation, which shows exactly that this was not something that strengthened the consumer and provided more for the consumer, and that the cost was borne by the corporation. It was the working class that paid for this. And the idea that somehow the consumer was better served in these industries afterwards is not correct. This is not borne by the facts. Um, Jimmy Carter laid the foundations for neoliberalism. I would not argue, and I have not argued my own works, by the way, on neoliberalism, that Jimmy Carter institutionalized the neoliberal model. Reagan did that. However, he was committed enough to Wall Street and to the Rockefeller family and the Trilateral Commission that he laid the foundations for the neoliberal regime that would follow when he lost the presidential bid in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan opened the floodgates for the institutionalization of neoliberalism, considering that in 1979, by the way, that's exactly what happened in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. So she started it in New England a couple of years before the United States. So the experiments first started in Chile by the United States under the auspices of the United States. Then Margaret Thatcher, who loved Friedman and Hayek, the apostles of neoliberalism, and then of course the U.S. fully implements in the 1980s. Carter paved the road, the way for all of this. Now let's turn to foreign policy for the next half an hour or so that we have remaining. Um, in foreign affairs, the Trilateral Commission, David Rockefeller, gave Jimmy Carter Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski and Kissinger had a lot in common. They were both academics coming out of Harvard. They were both conservatives. Brzezinski claimed to be a Democrat, of course, but his policies on foreign affairs were far more to the right than those of some Republicans. Brzezinski did not have a difficult time as one might think, because at the time, by the way, the Secretary of State, it seemed that he did have a difficult time, because at the time the Secretary of State under Jimmy Carter was a man who was a soft-spoken, very genteel individual. His name is Cyrus Vance. And Cyrus Vance seemed to be much more of an internationalist, like Cordell Hull, who served as Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't seem to be as hawkish, as militaristic, as fanatic when it came to US foreign policy and the approach to whether it was toward the Soviet Union and the talks about strategic arms limitation talks, SALT for short, and we'll talk more about that, or whether it came to dealing with China or any part of the world. He seemed to be more of an internationalist, a Wilsonian internationalist. Although, by the way, he too was linked to the Trilateral Commission and to David Rockefeller's group. Now, so the goals were the same. The style of Cyrus Vance seemed to be less abrasive than that of Brzezinski, who was this hard-nosed Cold War militarist. The rhetoric of the Carter administration, especially in the first, before, I should say, 1979. 1979, by the way, was a decisive year for Jimmy Carter in foreign affairs. 1979 was the year that there was the Iranian Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution, the U.S. and the USSR, that is the Soviet, massive assistance to the pro-communist government of Afghanistan to sustain itself against Islamic rebels, the Mujahideen. We'll talk more about that. The rhetoric in the first couple of years when Carter came in seemed to be pro-peace, pro-human rights. Let's pursue strategic arms limitations talks, SALT talks with Russians. Let's make sure we have detente with the Soviet Union. Um, However, there was a group called the Committee on the Present Danger, and that continued to press on Carter to become more aggressive, more anti-Soviet, more um, like Truman, more like Truman rather than Roosevelt. Um, the Committee on the Present Danger, by the way, was formed back in 1950, and one of the key founders, was Paul Nitze, a major foreign policy figure in the early Cold War. He and Dean Acheson, George F. Kennan, these three diplomats were the key players of the early Cold War policy of the United States. Paul Nitze made a comeback in the 70s and the 80s. He and Carter met, by the way. And Jimmy Carter found him very arrogant and dogmatic, and very militaristic, very fanatic, way out there, the way it's described by those who have written on the meeting between Carter and Paul Nitze. Jimmy Carter basically told some of his closest advisors, "This guy thinks he knows everything about the world and about how we should approach foreign policy conflict." And Jimmy Carter did not invite him to be in the government. However, it didn't matter because he had Brzezinski, who was not exactly a Paul Nitze type. Brzezinski had come from academia, and academics know how to finesse some of this stuff by getting to the same result in any case. In 77, Jimmy Carter did have a policy of the first year of his in office, of his presidency. He did have a policy of making sure the Panama Canal reverts to, after the 100-year treaty lease on the Panama Canal ends, that it goes back to Panama. By the way, this is interesting, just as an aside, because President-elect Trump wants that back. He wants Panama back. As an aside, um, it was during the Carter period that he reverted to Panama. But he also made it very clear that he wanted to support human rights on a world scale, except that he was selective where human rights would be um, applied, mostly toward communist countries. From Cuba to China to Eastern Europe to Russia, that's where it would apply. Uruguay was the exception, but other than that, for example, let's take two huge areas where human rights could have been applied under Carter, but it was not. One was South Africa. Yes, Andrew Young, who was, by the way, a big supporter, an African American from Georgia, civil rights leader with Martin Luther King, supported Jimmy Carter, by the way, supported Jimmy Carter, becomes U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And he talked, the rhetoric was great about human rights in South Africa, which had an apartheid regime. What did the U.S. policy amount to under Jimmy Carter in South Africa during the apartheid regime at a time that Nelson Mandela was in prison, by the way, to be released in 1990? Nothing. Actually, business as usual. So the rhetoric on South Africa, actually on Sub-Saharan Africa, was fine about human rights, right? Except that the policy was not. And then we have, of course, Camp David in 1978, the Israeli Egyptian amelioration of relations, supposedly to lead to broader uh, rapprochement between Israel and the Arab neighbors and some resolution for the Palestinian question. That was turned out to be a disaster. Now, there's scholars, including Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky and others, who argue, by the way, he did more damage than good here. On the surface, it appeared to be great, on the surface. In reality, Jimmy Carter actually had to pay those two countries, and Israel used to, in terms of not pay out of his pocket, that is, the US had to commit massive foreign aid to those two countries. They became the largest foreign aid recipients in the world in the United States at the time. And Israel used the money to invade Lebanon twice in 78 and 82. And it did not let up on its own apartheid in Gaza and the West Bank. It did not let up on the Palestinian West apartheid that it had imposed. The US kept pouring in the aid. I want to make sure that this is why I'm pushing the theme of moral man, immoral society, that everyone understands. I accept the thesis that there were converging interests between Wall Street and the American elites and the media, the American media, and those of the Zionist state pursuing apartheid, okay, then and now. I understand that. And that Jimmy Carter served those interests because he was the head of state, president of the United States, and his role is to carry out the social contract. Fine. And not to mention the details of the lobbying interests in Washington, D.C., and the money pouring in, not to mention that. Okay, fine. However, you should know that Jimmy Carter became one of the most outspoken critics of the apartheid Zionist regimes after he left office. One reason, by the way, many Jewish Americans who are committed to Zionism, because there are Jewish Americans who are totally against Zionism, who are committed to Zionism, did not particularly care for him and still do not particularly care for him and will not have a positive thing to say about Jimmy Carter because he became an outspoken critic of what the Zionist state was doing in Palestine, in Palestinian lands. Okay. However, what did he do while he was president? He supported Israel. Okay. In 1979, he had one good thing happen, and all the rest were disasters. He recognized, to his credit, because corporate interests on Wall Street pushed him in that direction, he recognized the one China policy. I remember him going on television saying so. And since he passed away in recent days, by the way, Chinese officials have come out and praised him. So China has a sense of gratitude. That is, the elites of China have a sense of gratitude for Jimmy Carter for what he did back in 1979. However, three other things happened in 79 which really stigmatized his presidency, and he himself would later argue that a lot of people viewed him as weak and ineffective and unable to get things done, whether in domestic affairs, because he got bogged down in foreign affairs or foreign affairs, right? So the three things are the Iranian Revolution, Nicaraguan Revolution, the Sandanista rebels, and then the USSR, the Soviet troop support for a pro-communist regime in Afghanistan. The worst of all those was Iran. Iran had been a loyal ally of the United States, and just months before the revolution in Iran that removed the Shah of Iran, the president of the United States had gone to Iran and he praised Iran, he praised the regime as an island of stability and so forth. Iran, a major producer of oil, committed to the conservative states, Gulf states, Arab states, and committed to Israel and to the United States and the West. All that lost. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who came in 1979, was not necessarily pro-Soviet or pro-Chinese, but he was not a friend of the West, because the Soviets and the Chinese had nothing to do with Iran during the Shah era. The Shah himself was installed as a result of a CIA coup in 1953. The U.S. put him there in government, overthrowing a duly elected regime of Mohammad Mossadegh, and they put the Shah there as basically a servant of the West. After the revolution, there was an administration that got bogged down with the issue of hostages held by the Revolutionary Guard in Tehran, in the capital of Iran. Those hostages were not returned during the Carter presidency. It was a gift of the Iranian government to the Reagan presidency. That, along with the Nicaraguan revolution, the Sandinistas, who overthrew another dictator just like the Shah, basically the Somoza dictatorship, the Somoza family from the 30s to the 70s had been in charge of Nicaragua, serving the very few local elites and foreign interests, basically US interests. The Sandinista rebels had started their opposition back in the Great Depression and continued it off and on. And of course, they finally succeeded in 79. Second revolution. And then there is the invasion, as the West called it. It wasn't an invasion. The government in Kabul, in Afghanistan, was communist. It was secular. It was a secular government, not like what followed after that government was overthrown, which was, of course, the Taliban, pro-Islamist, suppression of women, and so forth. It was a secular government. It invited the Soviets. The Soviets came in and were helping stabilize that government. The CIA and the Pentagon went into Afghanistan under Carter's orders and Brzezinski's schemes and the Pentagon schemes, and trained the Mujahideen. These are, of course, Islamist rebels, to undermine the government. And they set up a base because they were concerned about Pakistan, neighboring Pakistan. Pakistan was very important to the United States. The combination of Pakistan and Afghanistan for them has always been very important. They didn't want to lose the geopolitical influence of Pakistan, Afghanistan. So they felt the need, the CIA, that is the president of the United States. That's where the orders come in. The CIA simply executes orders. They felt the need to make sure that the government in Pakistan and the government in Afghanistan stay pro-Western. They did succeed, by the way, in removing the communists and overthrowing the government in Afghanistan. But what followed was a pro-Islamist regime that would eventually, as people know, be as anti-Western, as anti-US as any. That's why the US invaded in the aftermath of 9/11 in 2001 and stayed there for 20 years until they withdrew. Okay, that's all the legacy of what Jimmy Carter did. Now, those three things, Iran, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, alienated Jimmy Carter from anyone who would argue in favor of social justice, human rights, diplomacy as a means of resolving conflict. He now came under the dominant influence of Brzezinski. And Brzezinski, by the way, who boasted that he was so influential that he managed to elect a Polish pope. Um, in fact, the Polish Pope, I forget his name. In any case, um, Paul France, I forget his name. I'm not going to mention because I forget. Um, so Brzezinski was very influential in the Carter cabinet. The Carter cabinet came under his dominant influence. He was the Kissinger. What Kissinger was to Nixon, Brzezinski was to Carter. He was the Kissinger of the Carter administration. And the U.S. became very militaristic, very aggressive toward the Soviet Union and communists everywhere, the exception of China. Um, and it moved to the right. So Jimmy Carter, in the last year and a half or so of his presidency, moved the country, the entire country, to the right, hoping that his popularity would rise and he would be able to get elected again. He not only was wrong in his estimation that would take place. Obviously, the damage he did is he laid the foundations for the militarism of the 1980s and what would follow thereafter, as well as the neoliberal model that Reagan would adopt. The Committee on the Present Danger and Brzezinski, who obviously was in line with him, prevailed. Reagan brought Paul Nitze and the Committee on the Present Danger right into the White House. He brought them in, invited them in. He brought in some of the most militantly anti-diplomacy characters you can possibly imagine. He brought them in, and they would determine policy. Now, they claim they were successful, by the way, because the Soviet Union fell, except that the idea that the fall of the Soviet Union somehow entailed residual benefits for the long run, for the long term for the United States, has proved wrong by history. Here we are in 2025, the beginning of 2025. And the question is, who really benefited from the Cold War that Carter intensified under Brzezinski and the Committee on the Present Danger influence, and the neoliberal foundation that he laid out that was institutionalized under Reagan? Was it the United States or China? Who is right now the major beneficiary all those years later, decades later, of all that? China, with the largest GDP in the world, ahead of the United States by 8 trillion in measured in purchasing power parity, and estimated to surpass the United States in nominal value as well by the IMF and the World Bank and Goldman Sachs and everybody else. No one expects the United States to retain the number one role in nominal value GDP for very long. Especially when you consider, by the way, the US public debt level, also the result of the combination of militarism and neoliberal policies. Militarism that is throwing money at the defense sector in the trillions from Carter to the present. Today, it approaches, by the way, the new budget forthcoming is going to be close to just a shade under $1 trillion, $1 trillion. Yes. And the combination of that and the neoliberal policies of transferring massive wealth from the bottom up, to the degree that, as Senator Bernie Sanders recently pointed out, you have three people, the three richest people in America, Musk, Bezos, and Zuckerberg, own more wealth, three people, than the bottom 50%. By the way, the population of the United States is nearly 350 million. Those three people own more wealth, they have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the American people. That's the kind of legacy we have from the neoliberal oriented militarist presidency of Jimmy Carter. However, there is another Jimmy Carter, and I want to focus on him in the last few minutes that I have. This is the Jimmy Carter I deeply admire, and this is the reason I regard him as unquestionably the best former president of the United States of the last 200 years. When he left office, unlike other presidents who go out on a book tour, write books, have talks and not charge, they charge, and make millions and become millionaires themselves. Jimmy Carter did not do that. On the contrary, he and his wife Rosalind devoted themselves to the Habitat for Humanity. They devoted themselves to global peace, to the environment, to social justice, to human rights, to eradicating poverty, both in the United States and internationally. That's the moral man. He left behind, to go back to the theme of the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr of the 1930s, to go back to that theme of a moral man who, once free of the constrictive conditions of the institutions which he would have to serve as president and further those interests, he was now free. So he did pursue a moral path as a private citizen, a former president, using that. By the way, I have been to the presidential library because of my work when I was in higher education doing scholarly work. I have been to the presidential library in Atlanta, Georgia. When I was down there, he was deeply admired by the staff. They love him. I have been to many presidential libraries in the United States doing research. I had not seen that kind of enthusiasm on the part of the staff for any of the presidents in the presidential library. He devoted himself to building the presidential library. He devoted himself to building homes for the poor. He devoted himself to fighting for civil rights, for human rights, for environmental justice, for international peace. And to his credit, by the way, he finally spoke out and said, yes, Bernie Sanders is the right man to lead America, realizing in 2016 that America needs a path to social justice, to peace, to human rights. Also recognizing that the Zionist state of Israel pursuing apartheid policies and ethnic cleansing, obviously, were wrong. He was an outspoken critic against that apartheid regime. Like I said, As president, there were constrictive conditions on the institution of the presidency, which he headed. So he pursued policies that were not like those he could have pursued if he were free, a private citizen, that is. So I do believe that this is indeed a complex individual. By the way, a brilliant man, brilliant mind, worked long hours. Uh, One of the few people who worked, there are presidents who are famous for sleeping during meetings, when secretaries of state and defense and others are around and they fall asleep. And there are presidents like Jimmy Carter, who was super active and super engaged. Now, he has been criticized even for that, but I do admire him as a former president. And I do believe that he made a contribution to society as that. What he did as president, I'm sorry to say, is a different story, as I explained in this analytical video. I want to thank you very much for tuning in. I want to ask you to write questions, comments, whatever you like, and to please join this channel. This is an educational channel that my very good friend Asad Alim manages, and it's a growing channel. It's a new channel, but it's growing very fast. And we'll have another topic next time. Thank you very much for joining.